KZSU-FM Stanford, welcome to another edition of Hearsay Culture. My name is Dave Levine. I'm a professor at Elon University School of Law, as well as an affiliate scholar at the Center for Internet and Society at Stanford Law School. Today, I'm excited to have two return guests who were here solo and now return together, discussing their second edition of their book, For the Win, The Power of Gamification and Game Thinking in Business, Education, Government, and Social Impact, recently published by the Wharton School Press. Kevin Werbach and Dan Hunter are both experts in a space which is tried and true inside the hearsay culture universe, and one that has been discussed from time to time in the 14-year history of the show, I believe starting with Julian DeBell and his terrific book, Play Money. The focus here is not, for some of you, I'm going to be sorry to say, is not video games, but rather it is the use of game design and game playing and game theory to create a space in which people in business, in government, and education can innovate and be motivated. And in this book, written, I think, for really a business audience, Kevin and Dan take a deep dive into why we should even think of games in the context of this environment, and then how it might work in a step-by-step and I think very useful way. Of course, there are broader issues associated with gamification, aside from reference to an article in the book that I will ask about that challenged why we'd even think about this in this space, to some of the ethical questions involving games and what it means to be operating in an environment where you have the kinds of rewards and motivations that exist within what otherwise would be a video game environment. And so in For the Win, Dan and Kevin lay out a plan, more or less, step by step, using, rather than chapters, and I like this, using levels and leveling up, as it were, to finally level 6, the epic fails and how to avoid them. In our discussion today, we're going to dive into these issues, dive into both the practical and some of the theoretical points around these issues, but also explore more broadly what Kevin and Dan have done, which is really, two phenomenal careers in related but not identical spaces that are true topics for hearsay culture. By very brief background, Kevin is a professor of legal studies at the Wharton School, where he currently leads the Reg at Tech Roundtable and the Wharton Crypto Governance Workshop. He's author of the book, The Blockchain and the New Architecture of Trust, and he's been on the show before with his previous works. Dan Hunter is an international expert and well-known in the internet law as well as the intellectual property law spaces. He currently serves as the executive dean of the faculty of law at Queensland University of Technology. He was previously the founding dean of Swinburne Law School, where I had the pleasure to spend some time during the U.S. summer of 2017. Kevin is joining us from his home office in Pennsylvania. Dan from his office on the other side of the planet, at least from where we are, roughly speaking, in Brisbane, Australia. We were recording on February 23rd, 2021 via Zoom and Rode equipment. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me and returning back on the show.
Thank you, Dave.
Thanks, Dave. Nice to be back.
So you're both gamers, and so am I, although I force my kids to start with the classics of the Atari 2600 and the ColecoVision. You're more advanced than we are right now. Describe how your love of games brought you to write this book, and perhaps, Kevin, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I'll say I think that I'm what a non-gamer thinks is a gamer. The real serious gamers wouldn't call me a gamer and certainly wouldn't call me a hardcore gamer, but I like playing video games. So Dan and I both started playing a game called World of Warcraft, a massively multiplayer online game around when it first came out, around 2005. And this is a game where you have a community of people that work together in this massive open universe to kill monsters and do quests and other things. And, I know what was striking to me was just the depth of the social experience in this world, that it was, imaginary, it was orcs and dragons and stuff like that. But it was about people. It was about working together with a team and having all these kinds of interactions. And the guild that we played in was predominantly games scholars and lawyers that were studying virtual worlds. Dan actually had been doing this work before I had, I think we both were just taken by the power and richness of these experiences. And if you play games, you know this, but it's so easy to say, well, that's not real. Oh, it's real. It's real in some very deep way. It's different than the world we're in now. And you need to understand that distinction, but there's so much that goes on that's fascinating. And so I think that got us started thinking about how some of these aspects of games might be relevant outside the virtual world.
Yeah, and if for my part, so Kevin and I were playing this game, World of Warcraft, back then. We're actually playing it with Julian DeBell.
Were you really?
Yeah, absolutely. We dragged him in there. He had a character called Play Money, actually. That was his character. We tried to drag him back to the new iteration of World of Warcraft that's going at the moment, but he's a lawyer now, not a journalist, and so he's got better things to do with his time. So, but the thing, I think that we were each sort of, just playing. I was also kind of like looking at these spaces as kind of social and legal environments, and kind of writing about that from the kind of the law review side. But I remember kind of having this moment with Kevin where we were doing things in WoW and World of Warcraft, and we were just so invested in it. It was just insane. And then when you sort of took a look at the amount of effort for the return, it was ludicrous, right? Like, so, the actual value, if you tried to go out onto the marketplace to actually monetize any of the stuff that we were doing, it wasn't even sense, like it was, it certainly made no sense. And so we kind of got to thinking about it as we were chatting while killing a dragon or something, that maybe there's actually really something in this idea of using game mechanics to get people to do stuff outside of games. That's what gamification is. It's like we're not playing a game, but we are engaging with the world in a kind of a playful way that has game mechanics, techniques, principles, and so on in it. And that was where we kind of started. And it was interesting. That was really the point back when we wrote the first edition, which was published like 7 years ago. That was sort of the point at which the main kind of interest around this was in marketing, and we sort of thought, there's probably a broader audience for this. There's probably some really interesting questions that you could ask about this, and then of course we just kept playing the game of World of Warcraft, and
somehow you were able to leave the game and actually write a book, because that's often the challenge of games, as we'll talk about, the addiction nature of playing.
So there's downtime,
right. When you're not playing games, and I get it. So let's dive into some of these key concepts before we talk more practically. So gamification, and again, you disclaim that this isn't about video games. So what is it? And Dan, perhaps, I know you define it in the book, perhaps I'll ask you and I'll follow up with game thinking with you, Kevin.
Yeah. So it's basically the application of any kind of game techniques, game mechanics in non-game settings to get people to do stuff, right? So often the definitions that you see online are focused on kind of engagement with a product or service or that kind of marketing thing. But it's really anything that has these game techniques which are applied in non-game arenas. So take the example of trying to motivate students. You can give them grades, or you can have pop quizzes and tests and those sorts of things. But it's not a particularly kind of playful or game mechanical kind of approach, right? So you're not actually saying, like, you want to do this for fun, so let's actually have instead maybe a scavenger hunt, or let's have something where you have to work in a team to actually solve a puzzle, or those sorts of things. So any of those things, and these are very familiar in lots of different settings, that's really what gamification is. But it's basically taking the game stuff out of the game and putting it into real life.
And game thinking, which is related, of course, Kevin.
Yeah, game thinking just means thinking like a game designer. Most people who don't study game design assume that game design is, just make something fun. Or if you just create a bunch of graphical interfaces where you're in this imaginary world, that makes it exciting. It's hard to make a good game. The games industry is something like today, $150 billion a year global industry. It's massive. It's bigger than Hollywood by many times. And yet companies that are incredibly successful, have thousands of people and a huge track record, will still make games that are terrible, right? They flop because it's hard. It's a creative activity. And so game thinking is put yourself in the shoes of someone who's designing the game. It's very different to think about being the game designer than being a game player. A lot of game designers are game players, but playing is giving yourself up to the experience. It's living in that what we talk about, the magic circle of the game, and caring about the game. The designer's making the choices. And so game thinking is asking yourself, how do I get people to want to play this? Because the very definition of a game is it's a voluntary experience. If someone holds a gun to your head and says, you will play this now, you can hit the keys, you can do the activity, but you're not playing the game. You're not having the engaging experience. So game thinking means finding a set of strategies to have people want to do this thing and then to want to keep doing it. And that's really a lot of what we talk about in the book, that it's not just a matter of figuring out, how do I add a little fun? And then I'm done, because it gets old. And there's actually deep psychological reasons for that, which have a lot of research behind them that we talk about at a high level. But a good game designer does not just think about, how do I create a beautiful, shiny world that looks exciting for 10 minutes? They think about creating an experience, a journey that people care about and want to engage in, and different kinds of people continue to find it exciting. So game thinking is really a shorthand for all of those approaches that we then detail in the book.
So we're chatting with Kevin Werbach and Dan Hunter on KZSU-FM Stanford, discussing their book For the Win. So Kevin, as I was reading the book, two initial points I think are helpful for clarification. The first is what you just alluded to, and Dan alluded to. So when we think about gamification, it's not just with a goal towards an output, but it's also the process of creation, the process of motivation that matters. In other words, where is the deliverable in gamification from a business standpoint? Is it both? Is it one? Or is it something different?
Well, you need to distinguish those things.
Yeah.
We talk about a 6-step design process. And one of the first steps is identify your objectives. So gamification is not a 1 or a 0. It's either gamified or it's not. There was actually an academic paper I wrote that talked about it as a process of making things more game-like. But the point is, you need to start by asking, why am I doing this? It's a very different thing if you say, have a consumer product and you want to get some more people to buy it. Or if, an example we give in the book, you're a company that does helps people recover from strokes and wants to get people to repetitively do certain motions with a sensor glove they make for exercises that strengthen their muscles after a stroke. That it's a gamified service that South Korean company does for stroke recovery, but that's a very different objective from wanting to sell some more potato chips. Nothing wrong with wanting to sell more potato chips. I'm a business school professor, but that's a question you need to ask yourself, and there's a whole set of those questions that you need to start with. That gives you the context. And then there's a whole set of design techniques that, again, we can take from the understandings in the game design field about what it takes to do that well, once you know what you're applying it to.
Which relates to the other point. I'll ask you, Dan. So the management theory du jour, at least in recent years, although it's not new, is design thinking, right? And schools are popping up everywhere. I mean, Stanford's had one for a long time, but other schools are creating it. This is not design thinking. Am I right about that? Or what is the distinction or the distinctions between design thinking and gamification?
Yeah, design thinking, it's interesting. So we don't really draw that connection too much in the book, just because we didn't have the time. I didn't want to confuse people, but there's a pretty strong connection. If you look at the mechanisms by which people teach and do design thinking, it starts with kind of empathy for the user. Like, who is it that you are engaging with, and what do they really want out of this? So, whether you're designing the user experience for a court system, for example, or whether you're doing a new user interface for a platform, you have to start with, well, what is the user in this particular environment, and and as a human being, how are they going to experience this, right? So game thinking is connected to that, in that we start with this thing that Kevin has mentioned, which is, what's your goal? Is it to sell more potato chips, or is it to teach people how to have a language, or to learn a language, or to get better at their physical therapy? And then you say, well, and what is the nature of this person? Let's talk about the audience. Let's talk about who's doing it, and what are they going to find appealing and fun? And there are lots of different people in the world who experience fun differently. So we'll talk, I think, a little bit later about different classifications of game players. But like, to take a really simple example, competitive gameplay typically is something which appeals to certain types of men rather than women. It's not, that's a broad generalization, but if you are designing an environment which is primarily for women, then something which is highly competitive, where people are, going out there and quote, killing in people, that's probably not going to appeal to women as much as men, or older women as much as young men. They're just a different kind of characterization. So in that sense, the game thinking approach and the game design approach is very much connected to human-centered design methods. It's just looking at it from the perspective of, okay, we've got to make this fun, and what are the mechanisms that actually make this thing fun and more like a game.
So let's turn in that direction to this focus that you have about gamification for, as you say in the book, any serious motivational context, which of course is quite broad, but intentionally so. Kevin, I'll ask you, who is the audience for a book like this? I think it's quite broad. I mean, as someone coming at this from an innovator standpoint, to the sense that the radio show is kind of my business, and, we do a lot of that work, but I'm an academic, I saw that there were a lot of parallels. But the book, to me, is written for you can pick up this book and implement this, right, with obviously not just by reading the book, but with resources. So is your audience the business world, or is it, as you say, anyone who's in a motivational context and needs people to do things?
Well, it's an easy question. The audience for the book is anyone who will pay for the book and
or
read
that,
the book.
yes, yeah.
But no, that's a lot of people. So you're absolutely right. It is a practical guide. There's actually a fair bit of research underlying this, and there's more of it in the second edition, because in 2012, when we published the first edition of For the Win, there was hardly any academic research on gamification. There was research on intrinsic motivation and psychology, which we talk about as a foundation and so forth, but not gamification per se. Now, actually, there have been hundreds and hundreds of peer-reviewed journal papers on gamification. So we bring a little of that kind of stuff in, but it's below the surface. It's the footnotes and the bibliography and so forth. No, this is a book for people who want to solve problems. And one big class of those people are business people who either have an idea, they're building something, it's a startup, or they have a challenge in their organization. You've got a team of people that needs to be motivated to some task, which could be warehouse workers, or it could be management consultants. It really can be anyone. But it is broader. That's why we put that very long subtitle in the second edition, because business is one application. Education is another big one. Dan mentioned that already, that grades are just really kind of a bad scoring system for a game. We've heard from hundreds and hundreds of teachers and professors at all levels who stumbled upon these techniques, frankly, in a lot of cases themselves, and they used the book as a more structured way of doing it. But there's a ton of gamification in education, social impact as well, crowdfunding, lots of these contexts. So really the answer to your question is at a broad level, yeah, it's for anyone who has a problem for which the challenge is motivation and engagement. The challenge is that people have to want to do this, be excited about it, and stay engaged in it. There are some contexts where that's not the case. There are some things, for example, that are just never going to be fun. And there's some things where they're just always going to be fun. You don't need to gamify it to make it fun, but there's a lot of stuff in the middle. And it's incredible how broadly that comes up, how many different contexts we find where people are trying to gamify without even knowing that's what they're doing.
And you talk about gamification in the context of engagement, experimentation, and results. And I think we touched a bit on the engagements and results, but I want to touch on particularly experimentation, because that is always a challenge inside any institution, right? You know, the old saying about having to break some eggs sounds great until there's someone in the organization who doesn't want you breaking eggs. And then suddenly that experimentation goes away. Dan, I'll ask you, does gamification, at least as you conceive it, address the experimentation challenges in institutions, which personally I think are bigger than most companies and most institutions will admit?
Yeah, you know, I think experimentation and innovation generally in large enterprises is incredibly hard, right? So gamification connects with that, but I don't think it's the complete solution, right? So, you know, there's lots of literature around how you do innovation in organizations and how you do experimentation. I mean, one of the reasons why it's kind of hard to do gamification in that kind of setting is gamification is expensive and hard, right? Like, you know, the observation that Kevin made around games that fail, right? I mean, my example around that, whenever anyone asked about you know how have you gone with building games, I point them to the first time that Kevin and I taught gamification at Wharton, and we just created the lamest games in the history of the world. We spent a huge amount of time and effort. I don't know what the actual cost of that would have been if we had have costed it out, but it would have been in the tens of thousands of dollars. And every single one of them failed, right? Every student just went, "This is lame," you know. And so I think doing that in order to try to create experimentation within an organization is probably not the way you want to go. The one thing that is really great about gamification, though, is that when people are inside the magic circle, you know, that free space of play, they are more creative. They are able to give rein to themselves without having to kind of second guess what's going on. And you think about that sort of that Mihai Csikszentmihalyi sense of flow, or, you know, theory of flow, very much happens within games. They're very much connected. So that's really a great opportunity for those who are worried about experimentation, who are looking to do innovation. Games can really help, but, you know, I just want to make it clear that it's not a complete solution for every single problem that you've got in that space.
Well, and I was going to ask you about the relative challenges of using gamification. And I think before we get to some of those challenges, I'll ask both of you. So, being pressed, and I'm about to do it, what would be a prime, well-known example in your view, or one that's relatively easy understandable, of a successful gamification in the settings that you describe? And maybe Kevin, I'll ask you for, you've alluded to a few, but if you could, share a little bit more detail about how it played out in an institution, I think it'd be helpful.
Yeah, the one that we usually point to for success in the last few years is Duolingo, the online language learning app, which is the most successful language learning app in the world. Has something like 100 million users now. And you say, well, what did they do differently than various other tools? It's that it's relentlessly gamified, and gamified in subtle, sophisticated ways, and things that now people take for granted, like the idea of streaks, the idea that if you come back every day, you have a sense of like this ongoing streak, is something. They were one of the first services to implement that in a thoughtful way. They have virtual goods, they have points and levels and badges and all sorts of things. And the whole package is integrated really nicely. And that's a classic example where motivation is the barrier. Anyone who wants to learn a language wants to learn a language. They've got a good reason why it is valuable to them, either for their business context or they're moving to another country, applying to a school. They want to learn, but it's hard. It's boring to sit there and do it time and time again. So that's often an example that we point to. There's a bunch of other ones in the book. Mm-hmm. And maybe Dan can talk about some more, but there's some in the business context as well. Again, it's not that the context is so unique. Really, to understand what makes the good example successful, you've got to get below the surface and understand what kinds of game elements they're using, what are the techniques, and how good is the match between their objectives and their understanding of their users with what they built.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I can dive in just for some other examples. Anyone who's ever used any kind of fitness tracking system, right, has engaged in a gamified environment, right? It's essentially impossible. Doesn't matter whether it's Fitbit, whether it's any other type of system. They're going to have points, they're going to have badges, they're going to have leaderboards, they're going to have encouragement to keep going each day, because again, like learning a language, really boring, hard to get to the gym, hard to do the 10,000 steps, whatever it might be, right? And you just got to keep doing it if you want to get fit. So those are probably the two best examples, and they point to the sorts of places where gamification works really, really well and then just becomes accepted throughout, right? And so it's in those environments where people are motivated to do something, lose weight, learn a language, but it's hard to do it and you got to keep on with it. And that's really where gamification shines. There are some other really great examples that are much more unusual. My favorite one, like by far, and it's really, really old now, and it's actually been taken down, but I just think it's just, I mean, honestly, the greatest example of this I've ever seen. Every time I show people the video, they go, "Oh my God, it's the world's deepest trash can." And so these guys, Fun Theory got together. They have a trash can that's got kind of like this lid on it that's got a sensor in it, and that when you drop the trash in there, the sensor picks up that you've thrown some trash in there, and it's got a little speaker, and the speaker goes boo, and and it goes like on and on and on, and then you hear the clang, after like 10 seconds, and kids just go mad for this, right? And so they rush out there, they find all the trash that they can, they throw it in there because they want to have this particular experience. So you see it in lots of different areas, some good, some bad, some just really weird, but it's kind of omnipresent now.
And we were chatting again with Kevin Werbach and Dan Hunter about their book For the Win on Hearsay Culture and KZSU-FM. In reading this, what I kept hoping to find, and I recognize that it's a challenge, is where gamification could be used in places where the public and consumers have lower standards of expectation. And the example, of course, I'm thinking of is government, right? I mean, former President Reagan in the United States, famous really hateful words towards government. The worst, paraphrase, the worst thing Americans hear is, "I'm here from the government, I'm here to help." And I was thinking, I'll ask both of you before we take a break and kind of talk about some of the challenges and perhaps downsides of gamification. God, it would seem like if government could attempt to implement these kinds of ways to motivate not just the public, right, but to motivate the government itself to rebuild the esprit de corps, frankly, particularly in the United States, that would be great. I mean, voting is a form of a game, right, in that very rudimentary sense. But I'm curious if even if you didn't include them in the book directly, if you've come across any examples in the public sector of this kind of gamification being used or even attempted, notwithstanding, as you've already pointed out, the costs associated with doing it.
Oh, sure. So, the important point is, as we talked about, you have to understand the context.
Right.
And there are times where it's not a good idea to have people feel like this doesn't matter, this is just about fun. But another person who played in our World of Warcraft guild, named Constance Steinkuhler, is now a professor at UC Irvine, was actually in the Obama White House in the Office of Science and Technology Policy, working on ways to use games for public sector kinds of applications. More full-blown game design examples than gamification, but there's a connection. The other thing that we point out in the second edition of the book is that there's this parallel development known as nudging coming out of behavioral economics, which talks about applying what we know about biases and behavior to construct what they call choice architecture. So the classic example is you want to get people to save in their 401k, you change the default. You have to opt out instead of opting in, and all of a sudden people save more for retirement. And it's great, people want to save more for retirement, it's just that changed environment. So that's not gamification, right? That's not thinking about fun and engagement in the same way, but it's a similar kind of idea of understanding what actually gets people to act in a certain way and using ideas based on research to implement those kinds of systems. There's a lot of nudging that has been applied in the public sector, in particular in the US and in the UK. They had a whole group doing it with mixed results, a lot of success, but a lot of concerns as well. And part of what we talk about in the second edition of the book is this explosion of interest in nudging. Some of it is actually really gamification. It's actually more about these kind of ideas of fun and engagement. And frankly, a lot of the nudge examples, including the public sector ones, could be more effective in situations where applying some of these game design techniques, the aspects that are really about understanding what motivation and player types are, and the player journey, and these constructs that game designers talk about in games that are different than the pure behavioral economics, which is based on these sort of abstract concepts of what people are, that in a lot of cases could be applied to improve some of those applications. So yes, there are lots of examples, but as Dan said, it's not the right solution for every single problem.
Right, and you point out in the book the obvious one about a funeral parlor using gamification for obvious reasons might be an issue. Dan, do you want to add anything there before we take our break?
Yeah, I was just going to say, like it's often when we talk about gamification, people kind of go, oh wow, I just don't have the time and the energy to kind of build a whole game, and it's really complicated in the area of sort of governance, and like how could you do it? But if you think about really simple examples, like, so, everyone has driven past those speed cameras that are connected to the LED signs that sort of show you your speed. And if you're under the speed limit, gives you a little smiley face, right? So that is a really, really simple example of what is kind of like proto or almost gamification. You're being given a little dopamine hit, a little reward for doing the right thing, right? And you can actually build those sorts of elements, those tiny little elements, into much larger things that get people to do stuff that you want them to do. That's what gamification is: motivate people to do stuff that you want them to do. That applies in governance. It applies in making sure that you obey the speed limit. You've got if you think about electric car systems, right? And so particularly with the braking mechanisms that are returning energy to the battery systems, the early ones all sort of showed you this thing, and it would light up, when you were driving in a way that would actually extend your the limits of the car, right? That you were driving further because you weren't braking so much, or when you were braking, you were doing it in a way that would return power to the batteries. And so that kind of mechanism is a gamified mechanism, and it's all throughout different sorts of areas, governments and politics. You can do it easily.
You're listening to KZSU-FM Stanford and Hearsay Culture. KZSU is a nonprofit, non-commercial radio station at Stanford University that requires donations from listeners like you to continue its diverse programming. You can make a donation to KZSU by emailing our underwriting department at underwriting@kzsu.stanford.edu, or go to our webpage at kzsu.stanford.edu and click on donate. Gentlemen, I'm going to turn dystopian on you, but of course that is my want. And by the way, this is audio, but Kevin is using a background of a rather, at least to my eye, dystopian world such as it is, whereas Brisbane looks actually very charming, Dan. So let me start here. So literally on page 1, when I was preparing to do the interview, I thought, what would be the most dystopian pop culture example of gamification gone wrong? And so I wrote, and I'm showing Dan, but Dan and Kevin, The Running Man. That was immediately came to mind, the mid 80s classic. So, let me play for those that aren't familiar, let me play the first maybe 30 seconds of the audio of the trailer for the 1985 Arnold Schwarzenegger classic, The Running Man.
In the year 2017, an innocent man accused of a crime has a choice: hard time or prime time.
Sensational. Perfect contestant. I want him.
He must pay or play the running man.
On your mark.
I'll be back.
I did. I'll be back. I had to do it. So, the premise of the film is exactly what was said there. There's a game, folks. And the game is, if you want to be let out of prison, you can run into this maze where you're likely to die. And I use this as an example, not because Kevin and Dan endorse that form of gamification, but rather it raises the hard questions of ethics, right? And how we integrate ethics into this environment. You say several times in the book that a perversion of gamification would be the kind of, the kind of dystopian manipulation of individuals at the extreme that would be something like the Running Man, a game, literally for your life. But I'm curious whether we can be so sure, or how confident you are that abuse of gamification isn't already happening and wouldn't happen absent strong ethical guardrails. And perhaps I'll start with you, Kevin, on that one.
Oh, it's happening all the time. And again, when we sat down to update the book several years after the first edition, that was one of the things that really struck us. The first thing that struck us was just how much gamification was going on in the world, even though the fad was over. People were talking about gamification less. There weren't gamification consulting firms as such, but there was actually a lot more implementation. That was the first thing we noticed. The second thing was how many examples there were of bad and, in a lot of cases, manipulative and abusive gamification. Because look, this is powerful stuff. We're talking about leveraging deep aspects of psychology. We've spoken a number of times about this is a technique for motivation. You, as the game designer, as the creator of this experience, you create an environment that makes people potentially do certain things that you want them to do. And if what you want them to do is what they want to do, like as Dan talked about, they want to exercise and get fit, and you're designing something that's going to make them be successful at that, well, then, that's not exploitative. But if what you want them to do, say, is your Uber, and you want the drivers to keep driving longer because they're generating revenue for you, even when the drivers don't want to. The driver says, I'm tired, I've been on the road a long time, I'm ready to go home. If you Uber say, well, I want to gamify the driver app experience, which they did, to basically use a set of tricks and techniques to get those drivers to stay on the road longer, well, then that starts to cross the line. Because again, it's not that the drivers are saying, I want to do this and I need help. It's actually the drivers not even realizing that the gamified experience is pushing them in a direction that's not necessarily in their interest. So absolutely, it's all through the book. It was in the first edition, but it's even more so now, that gamification has to start with ethics, and that has to be all through the process, making sure that what you are doing is in the interest of the players.
Yeah, the other thing, if I can just jump in there,
Please,
right?
Dan.
So, I mean, I think the Uber example, is an example of the sort of the dark patterns that you get in app design and in web design and various platforms that happen to be a gamification example, and that those are ethically challenged kind of decisions on the part of the designers and the owners of those platforms. There are other examples which actually bring to mind some ethical considerations that are not necessarily bad decisions on the part of the platform designers, but they need to be aware of them, right? So the example that we use in the book is Robinhood, right? So just as we're finishing writing the book, Robinhood, which has hit the press recently around the GameStop thing, but before that, their big issue was that Alexander Kearns, a 20-year-old kid, was signed up to Robinhood on their stock picking app and engaging in the stock market, and thought that he'd lost $700,000 as a result of really essentially gamified kind of processes that he sort of sucked him in, and this feels really engaging and interesting and so on, and he committed suicide as a result of this, and of course his parents are devastated and suing Robinhood, and Robinhood have sort of some ethical questions. Now, it's not that Robinhood created an ethically challenged environment. They created a gamified environment that felt really, really fun and easy to use, such that a 20-year-old kind of comes in there, gets in over his head, and then commits suicide. So there are ethical challenges that emerge in gamification because you are getting people to do stuff, and every time you're getting people to do stuff, then bad things can happen.
Which brings me, and I want to push a little bit more on the ethics and the issue of neutrality around gamification by using another famous game from pop culture. I am an unabashed David Mamet play fan, and the most famous scene, right, from any David Mamet play is actually a scene that was not in the original play, but in the movie version of Glengarry Glen Ross. So let me play a brief clip of the game that Alec Baldwin delivers that sets up more or less the rest of the play and movie Glengarry Glen Ross.
Because we're adding a little something to this month's sales contest. As you all know, first prize is a Cadillac Eldorado. Anybody want to see second prize? Second prize is a set of steak knives. Third prize is you're fired. A, B, C. A, always, B, B, C, closing. Always be closing. Always be closing.
So quite a game there. And it raises to me the issues of neutrality. There's a debate, a constant debate around technology, and gamification is not a technology as much as it is, right, a process and a way of thinking. But certainly this debate, which you know quite well and which the listeners are familiar with, that technology is neutral and it's the use of the technology that's problematic, and therefore technology should not be banned, is basically the simplification. Given these two examples, right, the sales contest, right, that leads to people being fired, complete manipulation. Of course, in the Glengarry context, they're already fraudsters anyway because they're selling fake parcels of land. But what's your take on that kind of gamification and this question of neutrality? And this is just a method, and it's how people use it that's the problem. Dan or Kevin, both? Yeah,
Kevin, you can maybe talk about what Ethan has done in some of the work that he's done around exactly this kind of arena and how gamification works in sales. So one of Kevin's colleagues has done a whole lot of studies around this. I don't know if it involved third prize you're fired, but certainly it's second prize is a set of steak knives. I mean, I guess the thing is that, like, so technology or these particular mechanisms, are actually neutral, right? Like, I actually want to defend that idea that they are neutral in that they can be used for good and for evil, right? Or they can be used for something which has no kind of moral implications. The challenge with gamification is you're getting people to do stuff that may be against their interests. That was the example of Uber, the Uber driver, gamified component of their app. And if you're doing things that are against their interests, then that's ethically dubious. The mechanism by which you do it is, in this particular case, gamification. And the problem is that it can be really powerful, right? People are having fun or encouraged to do one thing which is against their interest. And that's deeply problematic. So that's where the ethical kind of questions come in. I don't think there's any general principle that we can say that gamification is good or bad. We can certainly say that it's really powerful in certain contexts. And the one sort of defense that you can say around gamification that you can't say around other kinds of motivational techniques is that people enjoying themselves is a first order good, right? Like if people are actually having fun, doesn't really matter that they're not really making any money and that they're being co-opted and all that stuff. They're having fun, and that's great. The other sort of downsides are, part of the moral calculus that you actually have to do in the implementation of any gamification system. But Kevin, you have some examples.
Yeah, a couple thoughts. One is the Glengarry Glen Ross example points out that the good and the bad of gamification in a broad sense is not something that started with World of Warcraft and video games, right? Games are not hundreds or games are tens of thousands of years old, right? And so these techniques have been around a very long time. The technology makes it that much more powerful because we can create these virtual environments and scale them up and track them and use data in powerful new ways. But these challenges have really always been with us. That's the first thing. The second thing is, well, in terms of neutrality, gamification is not a thing in the world that it exists there. And we're saying, is it good or bad? Right. If you're reading this book, if you are designing a gamified system, you're the one making it. And you have to make a whole set of choices in how you make it. What are, to use the fancy term, the affordances of the technology? And so, I don't know, it's kind of like if you're making a kitchen implement like a mandolin, do you make the one that I use that didn't have a very good guard on it? And so I sliced off a chunk of my thumb a couple weeks ago when I was slicing some potatoes. Now, is the mandolin evil?
I've done that also, by the way, Kevin.
I'm sure you have. Now, the other reason I did that is because I'm just clumsy and maybe I shouldn't blame the kitchen tool manufacturer. But the point is that the mandolin's not evil. Yeah, it's got a knife. It's got something, a sharp blade on it. But there's a whole set of design decisions that went into that. So the point with gamification is if you're sitting there thinking about this as a technique, it's neutral in the sense that it can be used for good or evil, as Dan said. But the whole point is you're not a bystander to that. If you are building this system, you will make a set of choices along all these dimensions we're talking about, both as Dan was describing what the context are where it's used, as well as like in the Robinhood example, what are the specific manifestations of this system? Do you understand that there's a risk that people are going to get addicted to stock trading? And do you put breakers into effect?
Kevin, let me interrupt you on that very point, right? Because that raises to me what is the most sticky ethical issue here before we kind of close the interview with some questions about gaming itself and what advice you would give. If we don't know the impact of gamification in the sense that, and again, your book, I think the book does a great job and very, very candid about issues of manipulation and addiction. Years ago, I had Natasha Shull on the show with her wonderful book, which both of you are familiar with and listeners are familiar with, Addiction by Design. And it was really quite eye-opening. She's an anthropologist and she more or less studied casinos, right? And went into the creators of the machines who are creating these machines solely to addict people to keep hitting buttons and spending money. If we don't know, right, or we're not sure of the mental, right, even physiological impacts of these kinds of systems, right, admittedly not technology, but ways of interacting with people, shouldn't that cause us to be cautious about using it? Or on the other hand, is this an opportunity, as I think you argue in the book, to really perfect and hone these skills for the greater good because of fun and just general, social benefits? How do we deal with that one?
Yeah, I don't see that there's a difference. Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a difference, right? So the thing is, like you're saying, we don't know, like the outcome of this, right? It's like we're experimenting with fire, and people could get burned. We didn't realize that fire was hot. We know that fire is hot, right? Like it's like algorithm, in YouTube or in Facebook, and they're kind of like, well, we had no idea that this would be really sticky, and that people would then end up going into, like being recommended for white supremacist groups. And so it's like, of course you knew that, right? Like, you've built the algorithm to actually be like that. So no one who's building these systems is unaware in gamification that people are going to get hooked in some way, right? That's the purpose of this. Now, the question is, well, hooked to what level, right? And we know we've got some pretty good indication what it's going to be. And then hooked for what reason? Like, what are they doing and what are going to be the outcomes for them? So that's just the ethical considerations that you make at that point. In the same way that there's now the techlash against YouTube and Facebook and a range of other social media environments that are hooking people in this way, we're going to see exactly that kind of pushback around gamification mechanisms that are actually problematic, right? And I don't think there's anything problematic about hooking people on learning how to use or getting fitter, or learning how to speak a language using gamification. But for other sorts of reasons, then it becomes an electronic lash that there is actually deeply problematic. So I don't think that I've got no illusions about the misuses that you can have about this, but at the same time, we shouldn't say, oh well, we didn't know, Your Honor. How could we have expected that particular outcome? We knew perfectly well.
When I talk to my law students, I use the late Phil Hartman's unfrozen caveman lawyer argument regularly. I don't know, I'm just a caveman, but I do know my client didn't kill that person. Let's turn in the last 10 minutes here, and we're chatting with Kevin Werbach and Dan Hunter, authors of the book For the Win from Wharton School Press on KZSU-FM, Stanford, and Hearsay Culture. You describe 4 types of gamers in the book. I was really interested to read this: achievers, explorers, socializers, and killers. Very quickly, how do we define them? Although they may be pretty obvious, but which are you and why? And maybe, I don't know, again, maybe when I post this on the web, we'll see your background, Kevin. At least my ignorant eyes, I might guess, but go ahead.
Well, no. So this comes out of some work by Richard Bartle, who's a famous game designer who was studying early what are called multi-user dungeons, text-based early virtual worlds back in the 1980s.
Yeah.
And he came up with this metric, and there actually are several variants of it. And there's, some other people who are in our World of Warcraft guild have actually done large scale studies of gamers and clustered them and so forth. The big point is not the particular ones. The big point is different people are motivated by different things, and every person at different times is motivated in different ways. So as Dan talked about, some people are more into competition. Some people don't want to play unless there's a winner and a loser and you can be the winner. Some people actually hate that. They're going to run away from that because they don't want to be the loser. They don't like that. What they want is the social experience of the game, the interaction with others. Some people want to express themselves and be creative. It turns out that the vast majority of revenue today for the games industry, and we're talking 8 or 9 figures, billions of dollars, is on virtual goods and customization. People are buying these skins and these clothes and so forth because they want to create the experience. And sometimes people want to explore. They want to see what you can do in the world. And so there are all these different ways that people relate to games. And the most successful games either find a niche. They're going to kill that niche and they're going to market to that niche and they're going to get that niche. Or better yet, they appeal to many different niches. They have aspects of the game where you can do different things depending on who you are or what you are engaged with at that moment. And the same is true of gamification. It's possible to design in different kinds of elements once you understand your player community. Who are these people? What are their demographics, psychographics, industry, culture, geography, that sort of thing, that you can design it in different ways. So it's not as simple as saying, well, I'm this, I'm that.
Well,
There's a whole bunch of tests that you can look at different scales and so forth. The real important design point is to appreciate the different kinds of player experiences and design for more than one.
But Kevin, I'm not going to let you off the hook. Which one are you? I mean, in World of
Warcraft, I'm only interested in 2 things. One is making money in the auction house.
Yeah.
And the other is the one that I share with Dan, which is fishing.
There we go. Very good.
So Kevin is a classical achiever, right? So absolutely like winning in the auction house. I used to be a killer, right? Like my main thing used to be like there was a particular spot that the guards couldn't get me, and I would just wait until someone would roll into town and I would just kill them, right? It was just great. But I've gotten older, right? And so these days I'm probably more of an explorer. So like one of the interesting things about that is people contain multitudes and they change over time. So you have to design for lots of different approaches.
Well, and you mentioned it, Kevin. I mean, I was an early user and adopter and lover of the Zork text adventures, right, in the 80s, and I would play through those games exactly this way as an explorer to see if I could find the entire world, and then I go through it again and I try to see if I could kill everything in sight. Of course, I was a teenager and it helped. So in the last couple of minutes we have a couple of questions. You eschew predictions in the book. You actually say explicitly that you're not going to offer many predictions in the book, and you don't, in part because, as you pointed out, the gamification theory and practice has expanded. But I will ask you, in light of what our world has faced over the last year with the COVID pandemic, I'm curious whether COVID has impacted our ability to gamify our world, or put it more optimistically or hopefully, can gamification help us recover?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little, we don't want to be too facile. Obviously, the pandemic is terrible in so many levels, and it's not just a matter that if we had a little bit more fun, that it would all go away. What I think has happened, one of the things that has happened throughout this experience is more people have seen this blurring of the quote real world and the quote virtual world. And some of that are things that are not really game-like at all, like the prevalence of Zoom. But there's a lot more of people coming to appreciate that you can have these rich, deep interactions in environments that are not in the physical world, which is part of what gamification starts with. And we're just now, I think, starting to see the development of a new generation of tools that try to create richer virtual experiences. I mean, we see this a lot in education, where you can teach a class on Zoom. I've been doing it for months. I work really hard and do a lot to do it really well, but there's something missing. But if you build, for example, experiences that create actual virtual interfaces, where people can, for example, stand around a table together and talk, they see the table visually, and you can only hear the people around the table next to you. That's called spatial audio. It's a game technique. You can integrate that in, whether it's a course or it's a conference or a virtual meeting, business context. And so we're just now starting to see better tools. Some of them have been around for a while, things like Second Life and so forth, but better tools coming out of the pandemic, because there's a recognition that there's a problem, and this is not going to go away just because we have a vaccine, and the benefit of people interacting across distance is still there. So yeah, I think we will see more exploration of borrowing and learning from things that worked well in purely entertainment-oriented game experiences coming out of the pandemic, but with the caveat that, yeah, there's a lot of this that, we shouldn't go anywhere near thinking that it's fun or gamification can make it all better.
Can I just add to that? Like, one of the really interesting things about gamification is its game elements without the game, right? So the approach and like the stuff that Kevin's been talking about, I absolutely agree. The life in a virtual environment now is completely the way that we are doing just all of our work, all of our lives in different ways as a consequence of the pandemic. The sort of the first approach to trying to gamify these environments is to say, well, let's actually put a game around it. And that was sort of, we see that in sort of the serious games literature throughout the 80s and 90s. And then they kind of went, actually, we don't have to try to make it a game. We can just use the game elements. We can use the game mechanics, because what we want to do is we want to make the experience better for people so that they actually come back and do it. And so you don't have to have, an entire immersive game environment in order to have a better teaching experience, right? You can think about these students as achievers or explorers or killers or socializers and say, okay, how can I layer some elements into those environments to meet those aims as though they were game players, right? So you create a social element, or you create a competitive element, but you don't have to build an entire 3D virtual world in order to be able to do that. And I think that those are the sorts of things that we'll start to see that will come out of the pandemic that relate to gamification.
In the last question I'll ask you, gentlemen, young people entering this innovation environment in 2021 are facing, it's certainly in living memory, unprecedented challenges, but particularly we're all technology and intellectual property lawyers. But I'll ask you, what advice do you give to young people entering this environment, say those that are graduating in a few months, either from undergrad or from law school? What do they do going out into this complex world? Kevin, I'll start with you, and then maybe
Sure. Dan. Yeah, I mean, obviously it's hard in a lot of ways, and there's some aspect to that just in terms of the the economic situation and so forth. But look, this is a new environment. These techniques are not going to go away. The kind of virtual experiences and techniques and technologies we have are only going to become more important. So, I think that we are starting to see the recognition finally that games are not just a frivolous thing that a few young people do. If you go out in the world, if you're a young person and you look for opportunities where these kinds of techniques are helpful, it's not that hard to get to a level of expertise where you know more than most people. And again, there's a whole industry and a whole massive community of communities of game design that you can learn from. And there aren't people who have been doing this technologically for 50 or 100 years. Again, the psychology and the basic techniques are much older than that. But the phenomenon, the field of gamification as a field is at most 10 or 15 years old. So I wouldn't say everyone should go be a game designer or do gamification, but yeah, it's definitely one thing for people to think about how they can incorporate these techniques, and the opportunity space is out there. Because for all the reasons we're talking about, the demand is only going to increase. And look, there's nothing bad about having an orientation towards wanting to create fun. That's, I think, something appealing to a lot of people.
Right.
Yeah,
Dan, I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, my observation is that for any young person who's graduating or even thinking about going into college, to look at this kind of stuff and is interested in gamification, you know, there's Kevin's observation around the expansion of this market, right? There's a lot of opportunities in this market. And the other thing that's interesting is that if you talk to the old school, you know, AAA game designers or people that are working in video games, there are only two pathways into that. It's programming or graphics, right? Like, so you're either a fantastic artist or you're a killer programmer. With gamification, there are lots more pathways in there. You know, so for people who are interested in political science or in psychology, for those who are doing business degrees, those who are doing law, whatever, there's actually a vastly larger scope for them to be able to be significant in this space and actually make a living doing really fun stuff that can change the world and be interesting. And so that's a great opportunity for people.
Such a wonderful topic, and we've run out of time, almost literally. Kevin Werbach and Dan Hunter, authors of the book For the Win, The Power of Gamification and Game Thinking in Business, Education, Government, Social Impact. Thank you for joining me today on Hearsay Culture. Look forward to having you back. Thank you for this contribution.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Hearsay Culture. Please stay tuned to KZSU for more diverse programming, and have a great day.